Today we're going to be talking about something which is super annoying and which has started to occur more and more often within certain Star Wars mediums. As those of you who also follow my friend and podcast co-host EckhartsLadder may be aware, Marvel's Star Wars comics seem to have developed a tendency to appropriate fan designs and fan art more generally for their new comics. EckhartsLadder has done, I think, 3 videos on this topic so far, all of which I highly recommend watching for the background on what I'm talking about here. There will be a link in the description to the first one. He's done a lot of the legwork in looking into this, and the purpose of this video today is to throw my own 2 cents as someone who makes a similar kind of content to what's being taken by Marvel with my work on various Star Wars video game mods. I also spoke to one of our concept artists, Valerie, who went to school essentially for this kind of comic development to get her take on what's normal, what's abnormal, and where these lines ought to be drawn. Drawn lines because comics. For this video, I'm going to include a lot of her concepts for ships that she's made for Thrawn's Revenge, some of the background art, and there will be a link to her portfolio in the description as well, so definitely check that out. Before getting too far in, I want to echo another sentiment that EckhartsLadder brought up in his videos. I don't intend to try to bring up any specific artist, editor, or other Marvel employee name in order to blame them directly. We don't know exactly where the failures and oversight occurred, for one thing, and my hope is ultimately that if there's some exposure brought to this, the right people can find out and the right changes can be made, so that people's work is properly respected, attributed, and compensated where appropriate. Star Wars as a major sci-fi franchise has a long history of fan works. From a legal perspective, it's debatable to what extent derivative or fan works belong to the IP holders and licensees, especially when it comes to the difference between someone making fan art of an established design and piece of intellectual property like, say, an Imperial Star Destroyer, and what changes when someone makes a brand new design and simply labels it as their own take on a Star Wars fanship. I'll also say that Star Wars as a whole has always been very good to community creators. Fan works are given a wide berth to make more or less whatever they want out of the IP, so long as it isn't commercially sold or it's not something like a standalone release of a game. This has been true under Lucasfilms originally and has continued under Disney. The important thing with this, though, is not necessarily the legal aspect, it's what people who put that much time into the work should be able to expect, the impact on the end product, and whether it's okay for Marvel to rely so heavily on the existence of this outside work, and spoiler, it's not. I've seen some attempts to defend this use of fan art by people claiming it's standard industry practice, usually conflating the issue of fan art tracing and tracing in general as being the crux of the issue here. It really isn't. If Marvel were simply tracing official designs to keep things consistent, using official assets made by artists who were compensated for their work, and which they could use to appropriately compose scenes, that would be a different issue. The idea, though, that tracing provided references or source material makes what we're seeing in recent Marvel comics as a necessary or common practice is false, though. When I brought the issue up with Valerie, she had this to say on the process. Source material is not always provided. That depends on the project, but usually it is the writer who will include those inspirational images. How detailed they get depends on the writer and the project. You only get sources from the editor typically if multiple artists are working on the series of issues. So imagine getting a comic script that just says, the Mon Cal cruiser flies through space. Chances are you'd get a picture or two that says these ships from Return of the Jedi with arrows pointing to them. Anything more than that and you're probably coming up with it. Not always, but often enough. As EckhartsLadder points out with his examples of the Nebulon K and First Order Dreadnought in his videos, both of which were from the comics and used stolen fan designs, it seems like often the person responsible simply Googled what they were looking for, found a 3D model they could manipulate in a browser, which is a fairly common thing to be able to find, and traced away. This is not and should not be the norm. The idea that this is something we should accept on behalf of the people who actually did the art holds no water. Star Wars in the past has had plenty of success with expecting the people creating the comic to actually develop their own designs and scenes. A great example of this is the Dark Empire comics or the Legacy era comics, which introduced several new designs and space battle scenes which obviously could not have been traced, which Valerie also went into. So to use Legacy as an example, Jan was the primary penciler and drew the main comic and story. Other stories in the series, especially the side arcs and tales, had different pencilers but they were still written by John, and shared inkers and colors across the issues. I bring that up because Marvel Star Wars is a bit of an exception to this. In the new Marvel comics, the hero faces are overly rendered, like movie painted over rendered. So yes, it is the artist, because that is something you have to want to do from the get-go. Furthermore, because of the minimalist of inks, I would also say it's a solo artist doing most of it. To save time, yes, tracing can be done. It is very helpful, but you draw over it. Usually people don't tend to notice because it's not exact, or it's a weird mix due to perspective. Because of all of it, perspective is where most people take a shortcut. If I showed you examples of my traced versus untraced art, you wouldn't be able to tell between them. Really, tracing is a bad term for the general practice referred to in most other instances. You know the game design practice of gray boxing? It's like that. So gray boxing, for those of you who are unfamiliar, roughly refers to the practice of setting up test environments, where you're still early in the process, so a lot of assets aren't developed yet, and because you don't necessarily know what aspects of the game or environment will stay or go, or where things need to be filled in. So you end up using a lot of placeholder assets, and you end up with, therefore, a lot of quote-unquote gray boxes. With artists compensated by the page, there's obviously an impetus for them to take this way out, but again, we don't know all the dynamics of the situation. It could be laziness on the artist's part, or it could be the results of rush jobs and undercompensated, overworked artists because Marvel wants to crank things out. Can you imagine, though, if the future of Star Wars ship development relied on how much fan art was out there for new designs to be based off of? Or if the Legacy era ships were simply traces of fan art and other space battle scenes, which depended on what people like Mel Miniatures had released as renders, as we can see with this trace scene here? I'll quote from Valerie one more time here, which I think gets to a very important point. Comic panels can't be random or primarily traced, which is why it's disappointing to see. We learn film composition for a reason. It applies to our craft and is something figured out in the layout process. I did this when working with a writer who kept having stories that were too short for a 22-page issue. It's nothing but composition. Panels, shapes, the figures for example, and dialogue to move the eye across the page. This is why you can't trace. You can only use placeholder references, so to speak. Things like camera height have meaning. Essentially arguing that tracing is the norm really makes the argument that there can be nothing new under the sun and that the cells are unimportant. Comic books, though, as a visual medium, are not about simply throwing an image for its own sake, rather than being an integral part of the storytelling with their own message to share. People do fan art for different reasons. Some are just in it for the fun of it, as Calamity Size Shipyards, one of the fan artists whose work was poached, including the Nebulon K is. Others can be people who do want to get into that industry someday, or who do want to contribute to the Star Wars universe in an official capacity, and all this will serve to do is to push them away. If Marvel really wanted to include those designs, then I'm sure a simple email would have gotten them permission for most of them, asking little or nothing in return other than a credit somewhere. They have, as far as I'm aware, so far not even responded when the creators contacted them themselves. Many people would love to have that on their portfolio, and I'm sure would have given permission. With The Essential Guide to Warfare, one of my favorite Star Wars reference books, Fractal Sponge, famous for many stunning new ship designs and 3D models, was contracted to do art for the book and had many of his designs canonized, and that's awesome. But even he has had his work taken by several outlets, and it's been a problem for a long time. Marvel isn't the only guilty entity of this. Previous examples include unauthorized use in everything ranging from promotional art for the Old Republic to the Imperial Handbook, Commander's Guide, which, in addition to Fractal's work, literally just took a screenshot from a mod database image gallery for Sins of a Galactic Empire of a torpedo sphere. Again, I don't want to try to guess at which individuals are or aren't responsible for this. The responsibility ultimately lies at the feet of Marvel more broadly for a lack of oversight. I'm someone who really loved new ships getting introduced into Star Wars. It's one of my favorite things to see, but I don't want to have to look at every new piece of content and have that doubt at the back of my mind that it's someone else's hard work being exploited for free by a company that can more than afford to do it properly. And in a world where there's plenty of artists who would love the chance to be included in that design process, but instead are being supplanted by Google searches to assimilate their work with no permission and no compensation that are supposed to be people's personal passion projects. That's going to do it for today's video. I want to thank Valerie for her thoughts on the subject and encourage you all to watch EckhartsLadder's videos on the topic if you haven't already. He goes into a lot of depth on specific examples and is trying to compose a collection of as many examples of the theft as he can. Either way, thanks for watching and hope to see you next time.